program in urban and community studies. We have master's degrees in urban studies and labor studies. We offer non-credit programs in a range of issues. We publish the journal New Labor Forum, and we host a wide variety of public events, programs, conferences. Many of you may have been to workshops or meetings here before. And this is part of our annual academic conference. Last year, our urban studies program hosted a conference on criminal justice and police unions. This year, we're hosting this conference on the future of capitalism and the future of work out of our labor studies program. So I want to thank in particular our planning committee, Ruth Milkman, and Josh Freeman. And I also want to give a great thanks to the center staff who helped put the event on today, particularly Veronica Ordaz, and staff who have arranged all your food and logistics for the day. A few logistical items I want to mention. Of course, please turn off your cell phones or put them on vibrate. We know you're all very busy organizers and activists with important calls, but appreciate taking the moment to turn off the cell phone. I mentioned before the bathrooms are just out to the hall this way here. There is going to be live streaming for the event today, so if you want to share that information with any of your friends, if you'll be tweeting or doing any social media, this is our hashtag Murphy Talks, and you can find the live stream on the Murphy Institute blog or on the Murphy Institute YouTube page. And if you need assistance with that, they can help you out at the front desk, because I'm not sure I can help you with that. So our conference today will be scheduled around 3 panels, 3 discussions, and we'll have speakers and commentators on each of those, and then we'll open the conversation up to you in the audience for some questions and discussion and comments. And just a reminder, if you can, we do have an overflow registration for this event, so as people come in, we're not allowed to add any more chairs to this room. We have fire code regulations, so if you can be moving in towards the center of the room, that would be very helpful for us. Okay, so this is a very exciting time for us at the Murphy Institute. We have been an institute, a part of the CUNY School of Professional Studies, but this fall we'll be becoming our own school. We will become the School of Labor and Urban Studies as part of the CUNY system. So it's an enormous transition, an enormous achievement, and we are very grateful to our director, Greg Mancios, to the New York State Legislature, to the City Council, and to our many allies and supporters in the labor movement, both locally and statewide, as well as many of our community organizations and community supporters, and all of you. So we hope that we will become an even bigger and better place to host these kinds of events where we debate and discuss the key issues of the day that affect working people and working communities. So stay tuned. Hopefully in the future you'll come back and we'll have an even larger lecture hall to have these kinds of events. Okay, so our topic today, the future of capitalism and the future of work, is a very heady topic. Lots to talk about, big discussions. Of course, that covers many different terrains and many different avenues. We selected a key few debates within that direction to go. And to start us off today, to frame some of this discussion, we will have Josh Freeman. Josh is a professor here, distinguished professor here at the Murphy Institute, Queens College and the Graduate Center. He has authored many books. His most recent is called Behemoth, The History of the Factory and the Making of the Modern World. And you can also get a copy of that, I hope, out in the lobby, but it's available in all bookstores, I'm sure. So, so thank you all for coming, and I'm going to turn it over to Josh.
Thank you, Stephanie, and I like the idea that my book is available in all bookstores. I'm not sure that's quite true. But I'd like to join Stephanie in welcoming everyone here today. And I'm just going to make a few kind of general introductory remarks. You know, I think we all know that capitalism is an extraordinarily dynamic social system. It's always changing. That's its nature. Sometimes the changes are small, but other times they're so large that they seem to represent a change in the fundamental nature of the system. to the extent that we actually talk about different phases or different kinds of capitalism, merchant capitalism, industrial capitalism, finance capitalism, early capitalism, late capitalism. We seem to even these days talk about socialist capitalism. So this is a system which has many variants and varieties as it has evolved. Of course, capitalism has been changing again in very dramatic and noticeable ways in recent years. So today's conference is really devoted to discussing those changes and what the future might hold for the capitalist system, and particularly, as part of that, what the future might hold for work within the capitalist system. As Stephanie mentioned, this is a huge topic, and so we picked 3 huge topics. There's subsets of this to focus on. One, the impact of technological innovation, particularly artificial intelligence and robotics. Secondly, the geometric increase in surveillance at the workplace, but also in the general society. And third, the impact of ecological change on work and on the political economy. Dramatic changes are happening in all these areas of life. You cannot literally, I think, pick up a newspaper on any given day and not see some article that's directly about at least one of these topics. But that said, the scale and the nature of the changes taking place remains unclear and much debated. Are these fundamental shifts changing the very nature of work and capitalism, or are they kind of more modest developments within a ongoing system? I'm a historian, and if you look at the past, we can see other moments when fundamental change seemed to be taking place that in retrospect sometimes did, but also sometimes did not turn out to be truly transformative. After all, none of these issues that we have centered this conference on are new. They're not new. Take, for example, automation. We have been hearing for 60 years now that we live in a post-industrial society as a result of automation, the impact of automation. In the late 1950s, there was what was called the automation scare. And this was a belief very widely held among unionists, government officials, academics, that technological advances were leading to a fundamental change. It would lead to mass unemployment and an associated social crisis. Today, I think the fear of automation-driven mass unemployment has sparked a great deal of interest in the idea of a guaranteed basic income. You saw something quite similar, actually, in the late 50s and early 1960s, when New Left groups predicated a lot of their political thinking on the assumption that there would be higher levels of unemployment hitting workers, including white workers, that would change the sort of political dynamics of the country. It was one of the pieces of logic behind, for example, the SDS ERAP project when they sent organizers into places like Newark. Some unions during that period of time, like the IBEW here in New York, believed that as a result of automation, they needed to maintain job levels by shortening hours. And in fact, in the early 1960s, there was a strike by electricians in New York City demanding shorter hours that was successful. But as it turned out, at least in the short run, actually the underlying assumption was wrong. Automation did not lead to mass unemployment. In fact, if you look at the unemployment rate for the 1960s, it goes down, it doesn't go up. And even today, 60 years later, we do not live in a post-industrial world. If you look at the United States or Great Britain, you'll see a big decline in the proportion of the workforce that's involved in manufacturing. But if you look on a worldwide basis, manufacturing employment is actually near an all-time current high. So, this suggests that we need to look pretty carefully as to what's going on because we've seen things that looked a certain way in the past that didn't quite turn out to be that. This is not just true for the area of automation. None of these areas are new. Take surveillance. Stephanie mentioned I recently wrote a book about the history of factories, and one of the things that truly astounded me when I was working on this book was stumbling across something called the Round Mill, which was a factory built as part of the largest textile complex in England in 1813. This is a long time ago, in Belper, England. This is a 3-story circular stone building divided into 8 segments that was directly modeled on the idea of Samuel and Jeremy Bentham's panopticon. Someone actually built a panopticon for textile workers. In its center was a supervisor's station, and from this one central place, they could look all around the building to surveil the workers. I was so astounded by this. I wanted to go visit the place, and I was then disappointed to discover they had been destroyed in 1959, which is not all that long ago, but it's an amazing concept. I mean, surveillance has been part of capitalist industry from its very beginnings, and all along workers have needed to deal with it. Just another anecdote from working on this book, I was visiting a Polish steel factory, a steel mill, and I was in the control room, and they had all these cameras on the floor of the blast furnace, and there were no people. And I sort of looked at this trade unionist who was my tour guide. I said, "What's going on?" And there's a sort of pause, and he goes, "Well, the workers know where all the cameras are aimed at, so they always make sure never to be in the sight line of the cameras," which reminded me so much of the traditional craft, ethos that you never work when the supervisor is watching you. So again, we're not talking about a new issue. And finally, ecological change and even ecological catastrophe have been associated with capitalism throughout its history. When you think, what's the most famous critique of the factory, my current obsession, I think it's probably William Blake, decrying the dark satanic mills. And that dark was both metaphorical and literal. In 1804, when he wrote that, he was speaking about the blotting of the skies in industrial centers of England, including right near his house, where there was a steam-powered grinding mill until the workers burnt it down in the 1790s. In the mid-20th century, cities like Pittsburgh and London faced what they believe were existential crises as a result of the extreme levels of air pollution, similar to the kind of crisis that many Chinese cities face today. So we are not talking about new issues, but we are certainly talking about new developments in these aspects of capitalism. So I think part of our challenge today at this conference is to understand just what we're facing moving forward, the scale and nature of these changes, the extent that they're continuities or ruptures. Are they novel threats? Are they existential threats? Maybe or maybe not. But either way, clearly things are changing in ways that impact our life. So we need to think about what's happening, and we need to think about how we want to react to this. And in structuring today's conference, we have a main speaker and we have a commentator, and then we have a second commentator on each panel who is an activist, who is directly engaged in their own immediate day-to-day work in trying to respond to these 3 particular issues we're dealing with today. I don't think any of us want the kinds of negative changes associated with many of these things, but each of these areas of transformation, represents a kind of a challenge, but also an opportunity. And what I think it's an opportunity to do is to think about what kind of future we want. What kind of future we want. And we live in a great dystopian age where we so rarely think, well, how should it be? We're so understandably engaged in dealing with, one assault and one atrocity after another that we rarely do that. But I think today is also an opportunity to think about, okay, if there's restructuring happening, what kind of restructuring do we want as we move forward? So we have a huge amount to do today, and I'm not going to go on any longer. And I am going to conclude simply by introducing the moderator of our first panel, which will deal with, I think we called it, The Robots Are Coming. This will be moderated by my colleague, Kafui Atto, who is Associate Professor of Urban Studies here at the Murphy Institute. Professor Atto is a geographer by training. He is the author of a forthcoming book, Rights in Transit, Public Transportation and the Right to the City in California's East Bay. And he is also currently engaged in a study of the sharing economy, particularly of Uber drivers in Washington, D.C. So, Kafui, wherever you are, come on up and welcome everybody.
Josh, thanks for the kind introduction once again. Welcome to the Murphy Institute. My name is Kafui. I'm at the Murphy Institute on the urban side of things. It is really my distinct pleasure to be able to introduce our first panel today. The robots are coming, or depending on your emphasis, the robots are coming. As the program indicates, we are really, really lucky today. We are lucky because we get to hear from three, who have now joined me, leading thinkers on what seems to be one of today's central questions. That is the question of automation, robots, what automation means for workers, and specifically, given the name of the conference, what automation means for the future of work and also the future of global capitalism. Our keynote speaker, who is directly to my left, will be Dr. Heidi Shear, who is currently the Director of Policy at the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. Prior to that, Dr. Shear was the Chief Economist at the U.S. Department of Labor. She may seem very familiar to you, and that's largely because she's a frequent contributor to CNN, ABC, NPC. Maybe her voice is familiar because she's a frequent contributor to NPR. Any of the networks that need an expert to deal with questions of unemployment. Following Dr. Shear, we have two very generous respondents. The first will be Peter Fraze. Peter is on the editorial board of Jacobin magazine and the author of the book Four Futures, Life After Capitalism, published by Verso in 2016. He's also something of a neighbor. We rode the train down together from the Hudson Valley, so it's great to have you. Lastly, we'll hear from Nasran Mohit, who is no stranger to the Murphy Institute. Nasran is currently the organizing director of the News Guild, she also affiliated with CWA. She is a well-known labor activist in the city. She is also a Murphy Institute alum, right? So, great, yes. So before I turn it over to Dr. Shear, and Josh kind of anticipated some of my comments, but I'll just go through them anyway. I've been asked to offer some kind of brief and broad, and they will be brief, broad framing ideas or framing comments. And I thought I would simply start with the same anecdote that I invariably use every semester in my own courses, and that's the anecdote dealing with the comments, and these may be totally apocryphal comments of Walter Reuther in 1954 or so. So as the story goes, Walter Reuther, who was the head of the UAW at the time, is touring a new Ford plant in Ohio, or somewhere in Ohio, Cleveland, Columbus, I don't know. And during the tour, the manager of the plant motions at some point to the factory floor where there's a conspicuous abundance of robots, with the dangling arms that are riveting car doors into car frames. And he turns to Walter Reuther and he says, He asks, so, you see those robots? How are you going to get those guys to pay union dues? And without missing a beat, and maybe this is the apocryphal part, Walter Reuther retorts, how are you going to get these guys to buy Fords? So, in the context of the classroom, I love this anecdote because, without getting into a long, prolonged debate on the organic composition of capital, on the falling rate of profit, on dead labor, it helps students focus on kind of a central contradiction within the capitalist mode of production, and a contradiction that begets all sorts of other contradictions and crises. I also think it's important because it suggests, and this is building directly on what Josh said, that the debates we're having today and the debate we're about to have is hardly a new one. And the question it raises is, to what degree is the debate today in 2018 different than it was in 1954, or different than it was, even more importantly, in 1964? Think about 1964. Phil Oakes releases the song, the Automation Song, which I learned the other day. And also, the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions published that open memo to Lyndon B. Johnson on the so-called Triple Revolution. One of those revolutions was the Cybernation Revolution. And so the questions are not new. And so part of the answer maybe is, we might be able to find in this conference, which is the context today, of course, has changed in important ways. One in which the questions of automation are now tied with broader questions of ecological crises, and also kind of disciplining of both labor that is in production, in the production process, but also labor that has been surplused. So I'll stop talking and turn it over to our first speaker. Please help me welcome to the stage Dr. Heidi Shear.
Thank you. It's a real honor to be here. I'm going to show a bunch of slides, including some that have some technical stuff on it. So if anyone has clarifying questions, just raise your hand. And I don't think we should get into discussion while I'm talking, but feel free to ask any clarifying questions, because you cannot be the only person who has a question if you have one. Okay, so my goal for these remarks is to provide a useful roadmap for thinking, a useful framework for thinking about how automation affects the labor market. So this is the roadmap for what I will cover. I will first look at the question of whether robots will reduce the overall number of jobs. And I just want to be clear from the outset that when I say robots, I am using it as a catch-all for robots, automation, technology, digitization, AI, the whole thing. I don't have a lot of information to distinguish between the different impact of different types of automation on the labor market, so I'm just lumping them all together. So first, will it affect the overall number of jobs? Second, I'll look at whether technology is going to increase or has or will increase inequality. And then finally, I will dig into policy implications. So taking these in turn, will robots, technology, reduce the overall number of jobs? And before I answer this question, I first want to step back and say, it is absolutely true that automation can and will lead to displacement for many workers who are doing jobs that become automated, and that can generate real economic hardship for those workers, and we need to think about that, and I will return to that. But the first question I just want to focus on is, will it reduce the overall number of jobs? Will it lead to mass unemployment? And I think the answer to this one is a very clear no. Technological change going forward will continue a trend, and the other speakers have already focused on this, but it will continue a trend that began as soon as humans started working. Changes in technology have consistently and forever changed the way work gets done. We have a huge history to draw on to show us that automation hasn't ever led to a sustained decline in the overall number of jobs. We've experienced upheavals, major upheavals, over and over and over again. Electricity, the Industrial Revolution, computers, et cetera, and they have never caused a decline in the overall number of jobs. I'll just start with what I think is maybe the starkest example. This shows the share of workers who work in agriculture over time. In 1810, more than 80% of our workforce was in agriculture. In 2017, it was less than 2%. This is an unspeakable upheaval. The jobs that 80% of people in this country used to be doing are now almost all gone. But while some ag workers certainly got displaced over this period, no one actually thinks that this led to a reduction in the overall number of jobs. The total number of jobs literally grew by more than 6,000% over this period. The whole idea that we could have ongoing displacement of workers by automation and not have it reduce the overall number of jobs, I think is sometimes counterintuitive. And here's some hopefully helpful logic. Employers invest in automation because it is cost effective. That means they can provide goods more cheaply after they invest in automation. I could have put on this graph food prices, and food prices plummet along with the agricultural employment share. When goods are provided more cheaply, consumers have money left over to spend on other things. That increases the demand for other goods and services. Who generates goods and services? Workers. So it creates jobs elsewhere. So numbers-wise, these new jobs typically offset jobs lost to automation. And if anything, technological progress in the labor market likely increases the number of jobs in the economy a little bit, but I think there's certainly no evidence that technology or automation has ever led to a meaningful negative effect on the overall number of jobs, and actually don't expect it to going forward either. We have a pretty good measure of the pace of technological progress in the labor market. It's productivity growth. So productivity is the total amount of goods and services produced in the labor market per human hour worked on average. So, for example, if robots are doing more of the work, so that more is being produced, more goods and services are being produced for each human hour worked, that would show up as an acceleration of productivity growth. Productivity is basically always growing because we are always seeing technological advances. This chart shows cumulative productivity growth since we started keeping good measures on this in 1948. This is the measure of technological progress in the labor market. And you can see sometimes it's growing faster, it's sort of steeper than other times where it's more shallow. And I'll talk about that in a second, but it's basically continually marching forward. And this shows productivity growth and the unemployment rate. So each dot is a year. The y-axis is the unemployment rate in that year, and the x-axis is the average annualized productivity growth of the prior 5 years. I use the prior 5 years because I thought that if technology was causing joblessness, it might be more likely to show up if there was strong new adoption for a sustained number of years, but it doesn't look, the chart does not look different if you use 1 year or 3 years or 5 years or whatever. But this chart shows that periods of high productivity growth are not associated with high overall unemployment, and it's actually the opposite. You can see that it sort of trends down again. Higher productivity growth is actually associated with somewhat lower unemployment on average. And I just want to make a few additional points about why technology does not reduce the overall number of jobs. One, technology is always leading to changes in the labor market, but the changes are typically gradual. And when technology adoption is gradual, it can be pretty easily absorbed. So to put some numbers on this, trend productivity growth right now is probably 1.5%, roughly 1.5% annually. So you can think of 1.5% as the amount of work that is displaced by automation every year. So it's not net displacement. As I said, other jobs will be created, but there's 1.5% sort of gross displacement in our economy every year. So it's not huge, but it's also not tiny. 1.5% is the equivalent of more than 2 million full-time equivalent jobs. But a lot of that gross displacement happens through attrition. So it's not necessarily people getting pink slips. For example, more than twice that many people retire from our economy every year. And obviously not all those retirees are doing jobs that are becoming obsolete, but it does provide a sense of how this kind of evolution can happen without the major upheaval that it might originally seem like it would cause. Even in industries that people point to as changing quickly, there are barriers to very fast change. So consider autonomous trucks. I Googled some things on this. I am not an autonomous truck expert, but according to Google, there are around 2 million commercial tractor trailers on the road right now. They each cost in the ballpark of $150,000. So that means there are $300 billion worth of non-autonomous tractor trailers out there right now. It is not like we're going to see venture capitalists buy all those up, trash them, and immediately substitute them with much more expensive autonomous trucks. They will be phased in over time. So even in this industry where everyone seems to believe that big change is coming soon, and I have no reason to believe that that's not true, it's still likely to be a pretty gradual process. Another key point is that generally, what gets automated is not a complete job, but specific tasks within a job. So in many cases, the mix of tasks in a job will change as a result of automation, but again, a lot of workers won't get pink slips as a result of automation. So just to put some numbers on this, there was an Oxford study that came out a few years ago that claimed that 47% of US jobs are vulnerable to automation within the next 10 to 20 years, and it got a ton of sort of breathless attention about the threat of automation. But it turns out that the researchers counted a job as being automatable, even if only a tiny task within that job was vulnerable to automation. Some researchers at the OECD redid that study more rigorously and found that only 9% of jobs are vulnerable to automation over the next 10 to 20 years when you count a job as being vulnerable to automation if at least 70% of the jobs of the tasks that make up that job are vulnerable to automation. So those numbers are not scary. We have basically always absorbed productivity growth over 10 to 20 year periods that is many, many times that number. And the last thing the last extra point on this, it's sort of a little bit of a tangent, but I know that I made the point that technology in fast periods and slow periods has never reduced the overall number of jobs in the economy, but it is also true, and perhaps surprisingly, given the sort of public discourse on this, automation has been unusually slow in recent years. And this chart shows that pretty clearly. I hope everyone can see this, but I'll tell you what it is. Look at just the top, the orange chart. This shows annualized productivity growth over different periods. So the top bar is annualized productivity growth from 1947 to 1973. That's the post-war boom in productivity. It was huge. We easily absorbed productivity growth that was well over 3% annually. Then, 1973 to 1995 was the great productivity slowdown. Then from 1995 to 2002, we saw that big resurgence, IT-led resurgence in productivity. Then we saw a deceleration in productivity ahead of the Great Recession. And then the bottom line in the top, the orange charts, is the productivity from 2007 to the present. Productivity in the recent period has been extremely low. And I didn't put it here, but it's worth noting that low productivity growth in the recent period is not just a result of the Great Recession. If you do focus on just the last couple of years, it has not rebounded. So the key point here is that the adoption of technology, far from accelerating right now, is actually at post-World War II lows. And the bottom chart there shows shows the same thing, same periods, but for capital investment, which is where you also might expect to see robot adoption showing up, and it follows the same pattern of deceleration in the 2000s And I didn't show it here, but if you look within capital investment at computer hardware investment or software investment, you see the same pattern of deceleration in the 2000s. So I guess the key thing here is that if technology were unusually rapidly transforming our workplaces right now, we would expect to see the opposite of this. We would see a surge in the use of information equipment and software in the labor market. That is what occurred in the late 90s IT boom. It is not what is occurring now. Okay, so to summarize my feelings on whether robots are going to take all of our jobs, I leave you with this. It says, in case you can't read it, what is it exactly? They don't want to take over, they just want to dance. Okay, so that's the first in my roadmap. That's the first. Will robots reduce the overall number of jobs in the economy? So moving on to the next section, will technology increase inequality? Here the situation I think is a little more complicated, but the basic answer is that I think the effect of technology on inequality will likely be pretty modest. And this chart shows that main point pretty clearly. So you see that top line, the dark blue line, that's the productivity line that we saw in a prior figure. The other line is hourly compensation of the typical worker. It's essentially the median worker. So the compensation line shows an extremely different pattern. Up to the 1970s, hourly compensation for the typical worker saw steady growth. It was in line with productivity growth. I always feel like I need to preface this by saying I am not claiming that everything was perfect in the 1950s and 60s. It wasn't, as today there were huge disparities, including along racial and gender lines, but it is a period when the median worker saw growth as productivity grew and inequality did not increase in the post-war to the early 70s. But since the 1970s, the story has been much different. Hourly compensation for the typical worker largely stagnated. So we've seen rapidly rising inequality since the 1970s, for most of the period since the 1970s, as growth was largely captured by the already affluent. So on this chart, we see a period of growing compensation prior to the 70s, a period of growing compensation for typical workers and inequality not rising. And then we also see a period of stagnating pay for typical workers and inequality rising dramatically through both periods. Productivity, automation, technology just kept marching forward. So I think it's very difficult to see technology as a key cause of rising inequality in the second period when it did not have that effect in the first period. And just to say what I think really was going on in the second period, and this will relate to more things I say in a second, that the rise of inequality since the 1970s was driven by other factors. And the thing that strings these factors together is that they all entail a relative deterioration of the economic leverage of low and moderate wage workers. So, for example, one cause of rising inequality since the 1970s is that the labor market experienced excessive unemployment for much of this latter period due to fiscal and monetary policy choices. High unemployment reduces worker bargaining power because one major point of leverage that non-unionized workers have is the implicit threat that they can quit and work somewhere else. And when employees have fewer outside options, that means employers don't have to pay as high of wages to get and keep the workers that they need. And that effect is stronger for middle wage workers than high wage workers, and stronger still for low wage workers. Globalization also contributed to rising inequality because it has been managed in a way that shifts leverage away from lower paid workers as firms have expanded their ability to source inputs or production from countries with a lot of very low paid workers. Changes in taxes, both lowering top marginal tax rates and changing the tax treatment of corporate executive pay, have incentivized capital owners and corporate managers to claim an ever larger share of firms' output. And then finally, there's been a shift in economic leverage from workers to employers as a result of the erosion of labor standards like the minimum wage, overtime protections, et cetera, the fissuring of the workplace, the erosion of labor market institutions, most prominently the erosion of union coverage, et cetera, et cetera. So my feeling is that the scary thing here in this second period is not the adoption of technology in the labor market, but the increase in the power imbalances between workers and employers. So that's the broad brushstroke answer to the effect of technology on inequality, but there are actually some important complications underneath that. So I want to say a few more words to hopefully provide a useful framework for thinking about those complications. And I'm first going to get wonky here and talk about skill-biased technological change. I don't know how many people here have heard that term, but it is a term economists use for how they think of how technology typically affects inequality. So there are some different iterations of this skill-biased technological change, but the general idea is that the adoption of new technologies affects the demand for skills. It increases the demand for some workers, and that increases their wages, and it reduces the demand for other workers, and that reduces their wages. And the key idea is that technological change has happened in a way that increases the demand for higher wage workers more than low wage workers, and so that's what's led to rising inequality over this period. And I think a useful way to think about this is skill-biased technological change is a way economists can explain rising inequality as not being about deliberate policy choices that shifted power from workers to employers, but instead just being a natural outgrowth of a high-tech modern economy. But it turns out when you test skill-biased technological change empirically, it doesn't actually hold up to the data. And I just want to say, because this really bucks the trend, saying that really bucks the trend for most economists, that I am not the only one who says this. This is a quote from David Card, who is a Berkeley economist. He's winner of the very prestigious John Bates Clark Medal. He says that the evidence of rising wage inequality is the evidence that rising wage inequality is being driven by skill-biased technological change is surprisingly weak. And just to get into a little bit why, an important problem is that there are many key dynamics of inequality that skill-biased technological change just is not consistent with. So here's one example. This isn't exactly the right chart for what I'm going to talk about, but we know that a key dynamic of rising inequality over the last 4 decades is its fractal quality. Stagnant earnings for most workers, the entire bottom 90% is the purple line at the bottom. And then skyrocketing earnings for the top 1%, that's the top line. Astronomical earnings for the top 1/10 of 1%, which I haven't shown here. And even greater uber astronomical earnings for the top 1/100th of 1%, also not shown there, et cetera, et cetera. Skill-biased technological change obviously cannot explain this. Technology has not increased demand for the skills of the people in the top 1/100th of 1% in a way that has caused their earnings to skyrocket over people in the top 1/10 of 1%. Something else has caused that. So that's just one example, but it underscores that skill-biased technological change just doesn't do a very good job of explaining the rise in inequality. So we can move on to there's another way to look at this. Riffing off of skill-biased technological change, economists Frederick Guy and Peter Scott have coined the term power-biased technological change. And I think it's a very useful term for understanding what's at play here. And the idea is that changes in technology can lead to changes in workplace power, and that can impact inequality. So in particular, when there's a big power imbalance between employers and workers, which is what we've had in this country since we allowed labor standards and institutions and other things to erode over the last 4 decades, employers can, in some cases, use technology as sort of a cudgel to further increase their power, and I will give you some examples. Technology that allows for micro-tracking of workers. The whole next session will be on that, so I will leave that there. Employers asserting that workers connected via digital platforms are inherently not employees with all the rights and protections that go along with that, but are instead independent contractors, even when the employer has great deal of control over their conditions of work. Another example is technology that allows for just-in-time on-call scheduling, which is terrible for workers who then can't do things like plan for childcare or take another job, or attend classes, et cetera, et cetera. Those things could very much increase inequality, but I think it's worth noting there that the harmful thing there is employer power, not the technology itself. But I do want to add that there may be a disproportionately negative impact on women and racial ethnic minorities if one assumes, as seems reasonable, that power-biased technological change is more likely to be used against workers with less power. I think it's also worth noting, however, that technology does not always have to cut in an anti-worker way. For example, the shift to online job applications may actually help reduce racial discrimination in hiring. Online platforms can help to organize previously isolated workers like domestic workers. So there are some bright spots here. So putting this all together, I'd say that the overall impact of technology on inequality is probably pretty modest, but it's definitely worth keeping an eye on developments like this. Okay, so then moving on to policy implications. Policies for those who get displaced. I know I bent over backwards to explain how technology does not have a meaningful impact on the overall number of jobs, but that does not mean that some workers won't get displaced due to technology. Some will, and we need to have things in place to address their needs. The thing people always turn to in this discussion is to talk about job training and retraining. That's incredibly important, should be taken very seriously. We should do a much better job at this than we do. But often the discussion stops there, and I think that that is a huge mistake. If the discussion goes further, the next thing that it typically goes to is the need for an expanded safety net to help those who have been displaced. For example, strengthening unemployment insurance and other programs to help people get by as they figure out their next steps. That's also extremely important. But again, if the policy conversation gets this far, it almost always stops there, and I think that is another mistake because it leaves out what I believe is the crucial third leg in a three-legged stool for addressing job displacement, and that is a good jobs agenda to increase worker leverage. One of the reasons that displaced workers are often in so much trouble is that new good jobs with decent wages and benefits are just not available, largely due to the fact that, as I mentioned, policy choices over the last 4.5 decades have eroded job quality for low and moderate wage workers. So we can and should reverse those choices to help make sure that when workers do get displaced, they're not dropped into a labor market where the available jobs aren't good jobs. And so just to tick down some of those things, we need to boost unionization. We need to do things like boost the minimum wage and overtime protections, enact paid sick leave, and pass fair scheduling policies. We need to enforce these labor standards. We need to help ensure that the economy is at full employment, not just for the jobs themselves, but also because a tight labor market increases wages, because employers, I mentioned this before, but because employers know they have to provide decent wages to get and keep the workers that they need. We need to make sure that globalization is managed in a way that it doesn't shift leverage from lower paid workers. We need to both raise top marginal tax rates and change the treatment of corporate executive pay to reduce the incentives that capital owners have to claim an ever larger share of firms' output. These are, et cetera, right? These are the kinds of good job policies that could boost job quality and thereby reduce the pain of displacement due to automation. And I will just make one final policy note. The good jobs agenda, the agenda to boost worker leverage, is also crucial for limiting employers' ability to take advantage of power-biased technological change. For example, when technology to do just-in-time scheduling comes along, workers who are in unions are going to be much more protected against having their employers unilaterally implement on-call scheduling practices. And then further, in the face of that kind of new technology, minimum fair scheduling standards should be implemented directly through legislation. So while I am not terrified that robots are going to take all our jobs, or even that robots are going to massively increase inequality, a good jobs agenda is incredibly important, both for the workers who are displaced to be able to find another decent job, and as a counterbalance to the ongoing possibility that employers may use new technologies as a cudgel to further erode job quality. So thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Hello?
Yeah, I've got one. Well, thank you for that. That was an excellent presentation. I'm going to, I think, basically agree with just about everything that was said, but maybe put a different perspective on it, politically, ideologically, normatively. And the thing I want to start with that I think is the most important thing in Heidi's remarks is the imbalance of power between workers and employers being the central issue. And that we should be focusing on that rather than focusing on technology in an abstracted sense. I agree with the basic analysis that there is not a sudden crisis of mass unemployment being caused by rapid automation. I mean, Heidi mentioned it, Josh mentioned it, that this is a recurring phenomenon. And I would say we can go even farther. You know, it's the whole history of industrial capitalism that there is this constant anxiety about displacement of workers by increases in productivity, essentially. Whether we're looking at, the Luddites resisting the introduction of techniques in the textile industry, and the Luddites are not actually reflexively anti-technology, but I'm not going to do that riff right now. Or if it's John Henry, the steel-driving man, competing against the steam, the steam-powered drill and all of this sort of thing. I guess there's two main things that I want to sort of say in response to this general line of argument. The first one is that I think we do have to understand that, as we saw in the graph, productivity is constantly increasing, and that has not led in any of these sort of waves of automation anxiety to suddenly all the jobs disappear, new jobs arise. I'm actually more interested in the political question of what are the results of increasing productivity? Who reaps the benefits of that? In particular, the fact that now it's sort of taken in these debates, or like one side says, oh, the robots are coming and they're going to take all the jobs, and then the other side says, oh, don't worry, there will be different jobs and it's not going to cause massive unemployment. But in part, I think that reflects a historical period in which the transformation of increased productivity into both greater wages but also greater free time was a central part of labor's agenda. That people had to fight for the 10-hour day and the 8-hour day, and then people talked about the 35-hour week and the 30-hour week, and that is much less talked about now, I think. It's starting to come back on the agenda a little bit, but I think that normative question is not, can we just keep creating more and more jobs, but should we be thinking about other ways that we can transform productivity into something that isn't just either more and more long-hour jobs or more profits for the 1% or the 0.01%. But what can we be talking about turning that into to something that gives us time? Because that is that is the thing you can see if you look at the statistics. I don't have it up to show you right now, but if you look at the statistics on working hours, you'll see that there's this massive decline until the mid-20th century, and then it declines gradually but flattens out, and even that is misleading because this coincides with women doing much more waged work. So the overall amount of time people are spending working for someone else for a wage is going up, even as, again, that productivity graph is increasing. So that's sort of the one thing, that's sort of the perspective I'd have on it, is that we maybe think about getting out of this framing of either it's the robots take all the jobs and oh no, or it's, well, we're all just going to we're going to have new jobs, even if it's all just, there's a kind of extreme version of the thought experiment here where it's like we're all being paid to, do each other's laundry or clean each other's house, and that's fine as long as everyone has a job. But there's sort of other ways to think about how we might imagine our society and our time differently if we got back to, the thing like John Maynard Keynes in the 1930s figured that with productivity constantly increasing, we should be working 15 hours a week or less by now. And that was a much more common way of thinking back then than it is now. So that's one thing I would say. The other one is, again, getting back to this idea of the power of workers and the power of employers being a big driver here. Heidi got into, the sort of the productivity puzzle, as, sometimes called, this idea that if really the robots are coming, then why isn't productivity growth higher? Why is it actually slower now than it was in a previous period? And I think one of the problems that arises often with discussions of this is that it treats technology as exogenous to the economy and to the labor process. In other words, it's something that, like, somebody in a lab invents something and it just comes in and changes everything, without sort of centering, as I think Heidi kind of did, the role that workers and worker struggles and labor struggles actually plays in exactly how technology impacts the labor process. And it can do so in what can sometimes seem a kind of perverse or paradoxical way. So that, as Heidi mentioned, you can have situations where labor is weak and technology is implemented in a way that essentially increases the precarity and the control over labor, the scheduling algorithms. A recent story that that has been going around is about technologies of brain monitoring. That, especially in China, it's like you have a monitor in your construction cap that monitors your brain waves so that the employer can better assign you or put you on and off things. And so obviously that is the sort of technology that is just for the purpose of increasing the profit of the employer without and making the life of the worker worse. And so, but then there's the other side of it, which is that if we think of technology in the labor process not as something that comes in from the outside, but something that's driven by an internal process of that power relation between workers and employers, we can think of it this way. If the working class is fragmented, it is weak, it has little ability to demand its rights in the workplace, then it can be easier for the employer to treat the workers themselves as machines than to replace them with machines. And on the flip side, strong, the good jobs agenda, is that one of the consequences of that is a world in which those well-paid, well-organized, ornery workers, well, it looks like a better idea to replace them with the robots. So one of the answers to this productivity puzzle of the where are the robots problem is, well, the labor is simply too weak to incentivize it. It may be that the technologies are there. I mean, there's an example, there's research from the Great Depression, for example, where for various reasons there was a sort of a wave of innovation that happened during the Depression, but that wasn't implemented until later, until economic growth and full employment came along to the point where it was actually economically feasible to implement those technologies. And so it may be the case that the sort of latent, rise of the robots is there, but we're not getting it because we simply don't have a sufficiently strong and organized working class to make it worthwhile to take those steps. And so I'll sort of close by where I see my perspective on this politically being, and where it maybe goes a little beyond where the political agenda that Heidi laid out. One example I'll sometimes use is in things like the fight for $15 an hour among fast food workers. One of the arguments you will get from employers, from propagandists of capitalism about this is, well, if you get $15 an hour for flipping burgers, you're just going to be replaced by the burger flipping robot, which does exist, although it does not seem to work very well yet. But stipulate that there's the burger flipping robot out there, and it's more likely to get implemented if the workers cost $15 than if they cost $8. And so I think our response has to be not to try to kind of deny that, because as I was saying, I think there is a sort of a basic logic to that makes sense as long as we are in a capitalist economy where where wage labor and profit are kind of the driving forces. Then maybe it is the case that the fight for $15 an hour leads to the burger flipping robots. And so then the question has to be, again, how do we make sure that that doesn't just end up with a lot of unemployed people and more profits for the owners of fast food companies? How do we turn that into, retraining and things like that, but also something combination of, there's been some debate about whether we should have a job guarantee. There's the universal basic income that's also been mentioned as a thing that's out there, but some way of making it a political question, and making it a question of, it's not just that we want, the $15 an hour. We want that, but that looking a little ways down the road, how are we going to close that gap that Heidi showed between productivity and remuneration of workers, both in individual workplaces and in society as a whole? And how can we, ending on just sort of the ecological note, as well as the just sort of post-work pro-leisure note, how do we do it not necessarily in a way that is just about more wages and more consumption, but about more time for all of us to do the things we would like to be doing, which is mostly not flipping burgers. So I'll leave it at that, because I'm at about my 10 minutes, and let Nastran take it over.
All right. Hello, everyone. So I think what I'd like to contribute to this discussion is a little bit of an explanation of some of the working conditions in the media industry, just because that is what I'm most familiar with. I serve as the organizing director of the News Guild of New York. The News Guild is actually a national union with about 25,000 members across the country. We're part of the Communication Workers of America. And the News Guild has represented editorial workers for over 80 years. And so I want to talk a little bit about really actually just touching on some of what Heidi has presented on, just about this, this change in a particular industry where we see on the one hand, a precipitous decline in newspaper circulation, for instance, where much like other industries where it was anticipated that there would be almost a whole-scale, I wouldn't say decimation, but certainly that newspapers were going to continue to go out of business, and that as circulation continued to decline and the business model could not catch up with this lack of, the lack of revenue, whether in advertising dollars, that we were basically going to lose a lot of media outlets, even with the increase in digital communications. And I think, in the last 10 to 15 years, with the explosion of digital media consumption for news, what we've seen is a rapid decline in jobs in traditional print and legacy publications, but not just publications, also small community newspapers, larger legacy newsrooms, of course, the more reputable ones obviously being the New York Times and the Washington Post, which I want to talk a little bit about. But really an explosion of digital media jobs, an industry that has not only exploded in growth, but really looking at the quality of these jobs, seeing that the jobs are there, but really looking at what kinds of jobs these are, which is what I would like to talk about. So I just want to preface this also by saying that, post-Trump, there has been somewhat of a renaissance in some newsrooms. We've seen actually subscriptions in some of the larger, more reputable newspapers like the New York Times. New York Times just posted, I think, a 26% increase in their digital subscriptions, which means obviously more money for the newsroom, more money for the staff. It is a unionized staff and has been unionized since the 1940s. The Washington Post, obviously owned by the richest man in the world, so they're doing fine. But really looking at the rest of, and these are really the outliers, and it's really important to note that because sometimes people will look at this, kind of renaissance in these newsrooms, and just the fact that journalists have been under attack, and that that has actually increased subscriptions in some of these newsrooms because readers really do want to get good news and they do want to support the workers. We saw this recently at the LA Times, which was unionized after 136 years. And during the course of the campaign, we reached out to readers, and within a month, we actually got 300 new subscribers just using social media as a tool. So I just want to note that because that really is kind of the outlier, and I really want to look at the rest of the media market and what's been happening, the larger trends. So for so many community newspapers, for the last 10 to 15 years, 20 years, they've really been ravaged. And this is not just because of a decrease in circulation. Obviously, the business model is flawed, but really just that the owners have bought up a lot of these newspapers, and they have figured out ways to do more with less. So the actual quality of the work, when you have 15 copy editors, and you can get 15, you can get just as much labor out of 10 copy editors, particularly when the 5 that you're terminating are older and obviously more expensive. this has basically been the trend, whether we're talking about fact checkers, copy editors, really just cutting down editorial staff to the bare bones. And that's really, in most print publications, that's the standard, is just cutting to the bone and doing more with less. On the other hand, many digital media companies in the last few years have exploded in growth. And when I say in the last few years, I'm not talking about the last 2 years. Looking back over the last 10 years, there was really kind of a bubble, an explosion in growth, not just of news sites, but other digital media companies. So we're not just talking about writers and editors, reporters, but also, content creators, what we like to call creative professionals. And the quality of those jobs, although there has been a decrease in print jobs and a rapid increase in digital media jobs, the quality of those jobs, obviously, particularly because this has historically been a non-union sector within media, the quality of those jobs are very poor. So what does this mean for an average worker that's working in a digital media company? It means not only knowing that there are 20, 30, 40 workers that would be happy to take their job if they say they don't want to work a 12-hour day, or they don't want to now do the job. If you were hired for a particular position and management asks you to now copy, edit, produce, film, do 3 or 4 additional jobs on top of what you were hired for at a particular salary, employers know that they have the leverage to say, that workers don't have the leverage to say no, and that they can fire that person and there'll be a recent J school graduate that's happy to take that job. And so, really just when we're talking about the quality of the actual job, workers are expected to be available 24 hours a day. So when we talk about the robots coming, this is the robot. So, and this is not specific just to editorial workers, to media workers. Obviously, so many other workers are expected to be accessible and available around the clock, but particularly for media workers that have to follow the news, they are tethered to their phone at all times, and they are expected to be accessible at all times. So the idea of work-life balance, an 8-hour day, even a 9, 10-hour day sometimes is just unrealistic for them. So what form does that take? Like what we actually think of a typical work day has transformed drastically. So that means as soon as you wake up in the morning, you're on your phone. On the train ride to work, you're on your phone. Throughout the day, you're stuck on your laptop, on your computer, on your device, or your phone. As soon as you leave work, whatever time that is, you're on your phone. You're on your phone until basically you go to sleep at night. And the difficult thing with this is that often some workers don't view that as work because the line is so blurred. So if you're on Twitter, if you're on a social media platform, what is that actually? Are you working, right? Are you looking for stories? Are you following the news so that you can pitch stories in the morning to your editor? That line is so blurred. And so what we often see with a lot of in particular young media workers is that they're very unhappy, and they're very unhappy with that working condition, even though they may not be able to specifically identify it and address it. They know that this around-the-clock expectation of availability is certainly affecting their quality of life. So the actual work itself, in a typical work day, has really deteriorated for a lot of workers. Just industry-wide, looking at the larger trends of casualization, we're talking about the kind of growing cybertariat. The casualization of the work in the media industry falls in line with so many other industries, where we're seeing a growing reliance on temps, on permalancers, contract-based work. To get a full-time editorial job often is very difficult, but an employer is more than willing to bring you on for what is marketed as potentially a 6-month editing job or an 8-month editing job, and then turns out to be a 3-year 1099 situation. And so I think with the discussions about the gig economy, we've actually stopped using the proper word here, which is misclassification. I remember years ago we were using employee misclassification all the time, which really showed that this was a violation of labor law. And it's so rare that I connect with workers that actually understand that they are being misclassified as employees. They think that they are 1099 and it's just a bad situation, but they're too scared to speak up. And when you actually look at their terms and conditions and the fact that they are functioning exactly like other W-2 employees, but they're just not familiar with the law, it's a realization for them that they are being exploited. And so I just really want to stress the lack of education around these issues is really doing harm to these workers who otherwise would understand that not only that their labor is being exploited, but it's unlawful. So what we see with some of the larger media companies is an entire, anywhere from a third to, a half of the workforce either serving as subcontracted employees. So this is not a 1099 situation, but they're actually working for a subcontractor. So they keep these in, so they avoid any legal liability because they're using a subcontractor. There's one in particular that we love. They always have great names. There's one called Global Employment Solutions that's used quite often within media companies. There's one actually at the LA Times called Aerotech. And so this over-reliance on subcontractors really just allows, obviously, employers to have these editorial workers working side by side with W-2 employees that they obviously have to pay more for. So it keeps the labor costs down. So the increase in reliance on freelancers, when you have to have a staff of permanent writers that have a beat, why not just have an army of 1099 writers that are pitching their stories to 1 to 2 editors, and having that basically serve as your editorial content. So we're seeing that a lot. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is, I guess, maybe the good, the good news in all of this. Also what Peter touched on as well is just that without workers organizing in these industries, we're going to see just even more of a degradation of these working conditions. And so I think that has been the exciting silver lining in the last few years, is that not only that digital media workers are organizing, but traditional print employees who have seen, the devastating effects in newsrooms across the country are also organizing, and not just in non-union publications, but also unionized publications that have seen hedge fund owners come in and increase profits. For any of you that have been following what's been happening with Digital First Media and Alden Capital. Alden Capital is a large hedge fund based here in New York City that has just completely ravaged Digital First Media newsrooms, including the Denver Post. And so where the typical profit margins in most newspapers can be anywhere from 2 to 8% or 3 to 8%. It's upwards of 30% with under this new ownership. So the model now really is to just go into these newsrooms, cut to the bone, keep as many workers on as 1099 and subcontracted as possible, slash as much as you can, and then flip the papers as soon as you turn a massive profit. So the upsurge in organizing is not just for digital media workers who are seeing that the only way they're going to improve working conditions in these digital media companies is by organizing and coming together collectively to fight for better and for more, and to have a seat at the table. But in newspapers who have longstanding union representation, organizing to push not only for community ownership of newspapers, but for entirely new community-based ownership that falls in line with where we were 30, 40 years ago.
Well, before I thank you all once again to all the panelists for great presentations and talks. Before I open it up to questions, and I know you're all eager to ask questions and to give comments, I want to give Dr. Shear Holtz a chance, if you wanted, to build on, to respond or talk about, to build on the comments you heard. And also I want to use my moderator privileges to ask my own question, which is kind of, which is going back to something that Josh said, which is, so why are we talking about this now? What is it about today, 2018, or the last 2 or 3 years, and sort of meta question of why we're having a debate on this, given the fact that almost unanimous kind of conclusion is that it's overhyped. So.
So I really appreciate. I thought both of those sets of comments were really great. On the whole thing about we could use increasing productivity to get back time. That could just be part. Oh, you still can't. Is this? Oh, I just have to hold it closer. Okay, sorry. Yeah, exactly. This is exactly. So I just think the idea of having increasing productivity growth translate into shorter work weeks is yes. If we could, I would add that in a heartbeat to the good jobs agenda. And then the other thing about how labor productivity might actually be low right now because workers have so little power that it's not cheaper to replace them with computers, to replace them with robots. I think that's absolutely a dynamic that we're seeing here. So I agree with everything that you said. Nastran, I loved your comments. I thought it was, it really does give texture to the thing that I glossed over, which is, we may not be seeing a decline in the overall number of jobs, but when automation replaces or other kinds of technological advances, it really does cause displacement. It causes real economic hardship, and the bright spots of increasing organizing in this area is just fantastic. And then the other question about why are we seeing this conversation today? That is a fine question. I don't have a really good answer. There's certainly a huge breathless conversation about this right now. I do feel like we all know this phenomenon of this sort of center-left gets a shiny new idea in their head and spends a lot of energy on it. And I think that that's something about what's going on here. Oftentimes it's a big distraction from the real things that we should be talking about, and I think there's definitely some of that going on here, but I'd love other people's thoughts about why this is such a big topic right now.
Okay, now it's your turn. Wow, okay. I saw you first. I'll need some assistance with the mics. Okay, you. Yeah, thanks. This guy in the back. Go with you. You. Why don't we take 3 questions in quick succession, and then we'll respond, and then we'll do another 3 in quick succession, and then we'll respond. So to keep it moving.
That's a good example, because to actually function today in the world of journalism, you have to know how to podcast, you have to know how to shoot, you have to know how to storytell. There's all sorts of things, and that's a good example of the problems of retraining workers. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are, because that can be broadly applied to all the different kinds of industries we're thinking about.
Hi, thank you. My name is Thomas Lopez Pierre, and I'm a candidate for City Council in Upper Manhattan. And one of the things that I'm focused on is strongly the Black community in terms of this relationship to work and education. Maybe 30 years ago, you could work as a subway token clerk, and make enough money to buy a house in Queens. And today we see that that's no longer a path to lower middle class status. We see in Rite Aid and fast food joints that they have, and movie theaters where they have, pay kiosks to pay. So my question is, in a city that's 50% Black and Hispanic, with a dropout rate, high school dropout rate of about 30% for the last 30 years, where is this population going to go in terms of finding jobs, low-skilled jobs, particularly with housing costs going through the roof so much? Thank you.
Why don't we just do these two? You can make it quick. Yeah.
Yes, I think why now has to do with the fact that almost every day there are announcements of new technologies that use AI. And the question is, why are they not being put into effect? They are in China, and I think our industrial sector investments are dominated by financial people who are somewhat risk averse. And I wonder whether if China does it, they will, and is successful, they will then adopt it. I see a greater threat, I think, than you do, in particular since some very sensible people have even predicted singularity when robots will be able to do everything.
I'll do one more, if you can make it quick.
Yeah, I was tying my shoelaces this morning, and I put a double knot in it. The question has to, maybe there's not an expert on it, but the question of artificial intelligence. It's well established that the human brain is inefficient as an engineering, but is superior in everything else. So, does anyone have any information about what amount of power does a computer need to produce a robot that can tie a pair of shoes, number one? And number two, what skills do you think are basic to give some kind of protection against losing your job to a robot? For instance, knowing how to speak, knowing how to spell, knowing how to do math, knowing how to tie your shoelaces, things like that. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just sort of touch quickly on a couple of these things. So this question of like the working class, especially like the Black working class in New York City, I mean, I think it touches on the kind of organizing questions that Nastran and I both kind of touched on, which is that there's sometimes this idea that we used to have these like good industrial manufacturing jobs or, transit jobs or whatever, and then it was replaced by service and, fast food and all this kind of stuff. But the reason the one kind of job was considered good was because people fought and organized to make them good. Back in the day, working in a factory was just as bad or worse than working at McDonald's. And so it's a question of identifying what the key sectors are today and organizing them so that this sort of the good jobs agenda that Heidi's talking about can happen. Because again, it isn't like there's no jobs. It's just that, they don't pay enough. Housing costs are too high. That's all out of balance. So that would be my only response that I would have to that. I had a sort of a little thought about the why now question, my sort of sociological analysis of it. Part of it is I think it just comes cyclically when there are just sort of waves of whether the new thing is factory robots or the new thing is computer algorithms. I do think there's also a dynamic that we see now that this stuff about artificial intelligence and, which I don't like to use that terminology because it does imply like singularities and human intelligent programs and things that I think are just very, very science fictional at this point. But I do think that there's a sense among like the kind of people that Nastran organizes, the kind of people who write the stories about automation, that it's coming for them. That it's no longer just about like the auto worker who's going to be replaced, but that, there was a few years back, IBM's Watson computer that won on Jeopardy, which was, the idea there was that it could replace junior lawyers, that it could, process medical records. There's been experiments with auto journalism for sort of simple things like financial reporting and sports journalism that are very like rote and routine, that you can have a program that will generate those things and that can replace the human worker. And so I think part of the why now is that it is actually the very people who are producing the hype about automation who are scared of it in a way that they maybe weren't before.
I had also another little thought about the why now. I totally agree with what you just said. And also, it's just, people's experience, like the smartphone might also be driving some of this, because my day-to-day experience of how I personally interact with technology has actually changed dramatically since the advent of the iPhone. And then people think that that is somehow speaking to how the technology in the production of goods and services, when in fact those two things are actually very different, and we're not seeing a speed up in technology in the production of goods and services, which is what the robots are taking all our jobs thing is about, right?
Yeah, I just on this piece about specifically around the MTA, we're talking about, you know, the transit workers union representing thousands of workers in this city, and really just, you know, I know it's just sounds so cliche for an organizer to say we have to organize, but these are things that we have to organize around when we're talking about, you know, a subway system that's completely falling apart, and we're focusing on the reduction of the toll booth workers. There are thousands of jobs that could be created to improve our subway system if we had a city that was actually willing to commit to that. So we're talking about a jobs program, and the quote-unquote progressives that we have running the city who are not progressives. We really have to get to the real policies that are impacting the jobs, and particularly our transit system. You know, instead the suggestion that's being made is to tax drivers. Most drivers that are coming into the city are working class people. And that's the solution that we have. So there isn't a political willingness to actually talk about where these jobs are going, and also the infrastructure of our city. So that's all I have to say about that point. But about this idea that a worker can do multiple jobs, I mean, this really hits at the points that have been made, that you know, it is complex, because on the one hand, so many more jobs are being created while other jobs are being lost. When you're looking at media workers who are expected to do it all, you know, we had a situation the other day where we had a training at our union for our members to come and learn how to take iPhone pictures, like really good, high-quality iPhone pictures, and we marketed it. And there was a little bit of a backlash from the unionized photographers, because someone had made a comment like, well, now everyone can be a photographer, a professional photographer. And our unionized photographers across the country, there was like a little bit of a backlash on Twitter, and they were like, how dare you guys suggest that, you know, any Joe Schmo come in and take the job of a unionized photographer, which is a highly skilled, I'm a Pulitzer Prize winning photographer, and I'm so offended by this. And really, it was just our members who were like, I feel my job is so precarious that I need to learn how to do this, you know. I need to know how to do it all. I need to know how to shoot and edit and produce. And that is the pressure that employers are putting on workers, that you have to be. And a lot of new J school graduates that are coming right out of journalism school, they teach them in J school, you have to be a one-stop shop in order for you to be desirable to employers. So you need to show on your resume that you're able to do all of these things. And of course, for older employees that have worked in these newsrooms, many of them unionized newsrooms, where their skill sets, their wonderful skill sets, which cut it for so many years, now just won't cut it, and they have a bullseye on their back. So, you know, I think, you know, just again, talking about the organizing that's happening now, I think there was a huge misconception that young workers would just take this, accept it, do whatever they need to do, but instead what we've seen in the last few years is that young workers are willing to organize and fight and win. And just looking at all of the trends across the country, I mean, I don't like to paint an overly rosy picture, because we're looking at larger economic models that are, you know, pretty extreme, but the fact that workers are organizing in the face of this, and they're saying, you know what, no, I'm not gonna do all of that. And you know what, I'm actually gonna turn my phone off at 8 o'clock. I don't want you to send me a message on Slack. I'm gonna wake up in the morning, and when I get into the office, that's when I'm gonna edit that piece. And you hired me as an editor. You didn't hire me as a producer and a social media editor and the bathroom attendant. You hired me as an editor. It said it in my job description. And you can't do that as an individual worker unless you have the backing of a collective body, also known as a union.
So I'm gonna go to this side. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay.
Hi, I want to go back to the question of why are we talking about this now? It strikes me as kind of obvious. We haven't really recovered from the crisis of 10 years ago. I mean, jobs may still exist, but they're much worse. I mean, think of like what the auto bailout was 10 years ago. The entry-level wage went down by 50%. Look what the teachers are. By the way, nobody's mentioned the teachers so far today, and look what's going on with them. But conditions in those states have been deteriorating for all this time, and everybody's talking about it, figuring out what to do. And there's been a big debate over what's the cause of whether automation is the main cause or globalization, jobs going to China, et cetera. I wonder, first of all, what people think about that particular debate. But the last thing I want to say is there was a bit of disparagement from the moderator about the rising organic composition of capital and the falling rate of profit. You have to understand, why has the crisis not really been over? And I'd like to say something like that is underlying it. And we have to dig into the deeper questions.
Hi, I'm John Forster from the Civil Service Technical Guild at District Council 37, so also been doing this kind of organizing work for a long time. So a couple of things. I just wanted to say in regards to what Heidi had said in terms of some of the solutions here and the job training. I think we have to also put that within the context of what we're really referring to as just transition now, especially in terms of climate change and the kind of broader agenda that implies. But my questions really are more, are we facing a broader universal challenge at this point technologically than we have in the past? The Industrial Revolution, for the most part, I think replaced or challenged intensive labor jobs, and yet what we're looking at now in technology goes well beyond that. And so I'm wondering whether we're looking at a qualitatively different kind of challenge. Totally agree that the end result of this should be a shortened work week. I think that was explained very clearly back in the 1850s and 60s by a very famous writer at that time, that that's what's supposed to happen when we have technology, is we're supposed to have more leisure time, and if we want to go fishing, we can go fishing, or if we want to go to work, we go to work. But that is where we should end up. And of course, I agree that to get there, the key is, in fact, union organizing, and I'm wondering also, though, is there a way to use robots or this technology so that we could do our union organizing more efficiently? Because at this point, it's pretty labor intensive, and we need to get more out of it. So just a kind of a question out there for that. And thank you all, by the way, for great presentations.
Hi. Okay. I have to talk a bit to set up this question. So if we think of like Marx's circuit of capital as money and then commodities and then more money, which is collected by the capitalists, and then most forms of labor now being kind of abstracted. So like if you work as a salesperson, you're not really selling a commodity, you're selling your services. And then if we think of a lot of sites today like Facebook and Google and such, harvesting your data almost as a commodity, could we then think of like different ways of value capture? So for instance, creating sites where like you kind of get paid or something for that data, or the idea that like if you take the Alexa thing into your home, you should really be getting paid to have that, given how invasive it is. And other ideas like the robot tax and stuff like that. What do we think about these other alternatives?
Well, that was actually a question, and I guess like most people, I'm not going to ask a question. I love coming to these things. I get new information. I see data. I hear people talk about theories, and then I myself try to say something pretty concrete. I think there's something that's been left out of the analysis about the relationship between increasing production and change to technology and having no effect on the overall unemployment rates, and that's the role of place. people live in places, and at least in a lot of, until the most modern times when everybody's working online, their jobs were in places. Industries tend to concentrate in places. I'm from West Virginia, so I know from my own personal experience, I know resource extraction, and I know the chemical industries that are dependent upon that. And I grew up at a time when I could see the levels of production not changing, even though the amount of employment in those industries just declined precipitously. That change, caused by technological change, it was caused by a shift in the way coal was extracted, devastates those communities. The people have their families around them, their communities, and you're either left with a community with massive unemployment or a community that no longer exists because all the people in it moved to the place where the jobs are. I think that when we look at these effects at the level of the whole US economy, we're missing the fact that all the losses are going to happen in one place while the gains are likely to have somewhere else, someplace else. Now, we see this in the terminology that we use. We talk about workers being displaced. We talk about dislocation in an economy. So I think that when we look at it just at the whole US scale, we're missing that. And I think that had an effect in the most recent election.
So, yeah, shoot.
Do you want to try? I can say a few things, and I will try not to babble on. Okay, wait. Oh, so this question of we haven't recovered from the Great Recession yet. So the jobs numbers came out this. Oh, I will never remember that. Right. Okay. We got the what month are we in now? May. So we got the April jobs numbers out this morning. The unemployment rate is now 3.9%. It's so. That's a whole different conversation. But so we have, as far, I mean, we are now at, I don't actually think we're at full employment yet, but we are really inching towards full employment. The overall labor market, as far as the number of jobs that are out there, it's solid. The wage growth remains extremely tepid. So I can't remember what the, right, I guess I can't remember how this question was connected to the technology stuff, but it was, that is being heralded this, why are we seeing such tight labor markets and such weak wage growth? That seems to be super puzzling to all the public commentators. Why is this happening? And I think we know why, because of all of the things that we've talked about, that the standards, institutions, everything just aren't in place that would allow workers to really see the leverage shifted back towards them as a result of the really tight labor markets. Okay. This question of, is this time different? As far as I went over the history of how we have seen this technological change over and over and over again, that is, so the backdrop to this conversation is because of the data that we have seen, the only thing that people who are saying that the robots are going to take all our jobs can appeal to is that this time it's going to be different. Because if you look at we have such a long history of evidence that we've seen major upheavals before and it hasn't caused job loss. So we could, you can't rule out the case that, nope, the last gajillion years of experience are not relevant here and this time it's going to be totally different. We do know that the type of upheaval will be very different, but it's hard to imagine that there'll be something more dramatic than the decline in ag employment. Like, we went from 80% of the workforce working in ag to now it's less than 2%. Like, even though what this coming upheaval will look like on the ground will be different, it's hard to imagine that impact would be more dramatic than that. But you know, it could. We can't rule out the fact that maybe this time is actually totally different. I don't believe that it will be. This question of could we use technology to actually organize more efficiently? I think yes, yes, and yes. So I touched on that a little bit, but being able to that technology does not always have to break in an anti-worker way, and that there's a lot of interesting organizing going on that can actually capitalize on some of the technology to bring workers together who may have been isolated, that sort of stuff. So I think that's a really great line of thinking to pursue. And then this question of the role of place in I show nationally, we do not see a relationship between, if anything, it goes between unemployment and productivity growth. That I fully admit that that's looking at the national level and is leaving out a huge, it's masking a ton of real pain as workers in places or in certain kind of jobs get displaced. One of the things that just means is in that good jobs agenda, that full employment policy is really important. But then once we get to full employment nationally, it still means that there are places that are left behind. And that takes even more investments. Like you could think of national priorities that we have, like care jobs, infrastructure, other kinds of national priorities that we want to invest in anyway. You could really target them towards places that have been left behind, even when we're as a nation at full employment. So I think that's just a point well taken, and I think there's clearly policy solutions that could help that.
Yeah, I mean, just to this question of like, have we recovered from the 2008 crisis? I mean, my sort of framing would generally be we haven't recovered from the crisis of the 1970s that produced the neoliberal period. I do sort of, on the one hand, I also do have that sort of like, I have that pundit, that instinct to say, well, if we're close to full employment, that should, like, I've read my Michal Koletsky on the political aspects of full employment. It should actually create pressure, but of course, to be a broken record again, that requires the actual organizing to take advantage of a situation in which workers have more leverage than they did before. And then, as again, you were saying, this is very spatially varied, and that's an issue. There was a question, the one thing I just wanted to sort of address was the woman in the back who mentioned kind of the circuits of capital and different kinds of work. To me, I mean, they're very, I consider myself a Marxist, but there are different ways of looking at this question of like how the sort of what we think of as the point of production, of commodity production, relates to the entire circuit of capital. Extraction, production, circulation, distribution, in addition to things that are not waged at all, the work that's some paid but much not paid to, raise and educate children to produce the actual workforce. To me, these are all potentially political sites of struggle. Of course, there was a period of time in which it was thought for particular sort of sociological and historically specific reasons that workers massed in large industrial factories were the kind of a key point to emphasize. But I don't think, we're not in that. Even though, as Josh said in the beginning, it's not like manufacturing is disappeared, although even in China they're bringing in the robots. But it is, I think that is part of this like answer to this question of like, why isn't full employment producing the effects that a sort of abstract model would predict, and that's partly that we're still finding forms of organizing that can take advantage of that. That are more complex than you've got a big factory with a lot of people who can shut down the assembly line. So yeah, I'll end with that. I just want to know what Nasran thinks about what she would want from a union organizing robot.
Do you want to take that up?
Yeah, so I mean, I think just the visual really was really amazing. I was just like, I could just sit back and send them out. But I think, I think especially looking at the importance of digital platforms and social media in particular in so many of the exciting organizing campaigns that have happened in the last few years. I mean, it's a given that it's bolstered the organizing in media. Obviously, media workers are using those social media platforms all the time to share their work. And so it's really opened up this incredible space for them to now connect with other media workers across the country and across the world and talk about their working conditions, about their organizing drives. It's shown a huge spotlight on employers so that if they start an anti-union campaign or anything really that happens in the newsroom, in the workplace, that it's within 5 minutes it's on Twitter. So this is an incredible tool, but to see so many other industries, so many other types of workers use this as a tool, I think it just shows that workers can connect with one another in ways that were not possible previously. That being said, nothing replaces good old-fashioned organizing, human-to-human contact. And I think, not a lot of journalists I have met are necessarily Marxist socialists, but I have to say that in organizing media workers that maybe they went to a really good school, maybe they graduated from an amazing J school, and then they enter into the labor market and they see that they are completely replaceable, and they understand their own precarity. And then through the organizing, being able to, when especially you're told that as an individual intellectual worker, you're unique, and you're gonna brand yourself, and you're gonna have 100,000 Twitter followers, and it's all about the branding and marketing of the individual journalist. And this is really what you're taught throughout your schooling, and then you enter into the workplace and you see that all of that is bullshit. And then through the organizing, you actually can connect with other workers on a human level, and that experience has really, I think, I've witnessed a kind of deepening and developing of consciousness in some highly educated, highly skilled intellectual workers that I myself never imagined. I come out of a history of organizing mostly low-wage immigrant workers, and so that's been, and I think it really is a lesson for all of us that when we look at whether we're looking at academic workers or journalists, that the precarity in these industries I was really forcing, organizing in a lot of these industries. And so I think that using digital media platforms to connect with other workers, to connect struggles, to connect with the working class, to see, highly skilled intellectual workers say, wait, I've been watching everything that's been happening in West Virginia and Arizona, and previously, I gotta tell you, I didn't really care about any of this stuff, but now I actually wanna go out and support them on the picket line. That is mostly because of just this access to information that we didn't previously have. So it's never going to replace good old-fashioned organizing, but it certainly can serve the organizing in really deep ways.
From this side, 1, 2, 3, 4, perfect.
I had a question that's maybe more directed at Heidi in terms of the technological change and its pace. I mean, we hear a lot of anecdotal stories that the pace of technological change is now increasing. And how is this related to also stories we hear that people today entering the job market now are going to be in 10 or 11, fill in the number, jobs in their lifetime, whereas when I entered the labor market, I looked at my grandfather and my father, construction, manufacturing. They worked for decades at their one job. And most people today don't even think of that anymore. Is this really occurring, or is this something that always happened? And because it also bears upon organizing. If you have a constantly churning labor force in any one industry, it makes it very hard to organize. So I'm just wondering, are these anecdotes really a reflection of a larger reality, or is it really happen? Is it happening?
Yeah, one thing I haven't heard from today at all are the words privatization. And, technology can be quite neutral. We can use it to our good or to our bad. And you have to know who owns the technology. And all our developments, almost all, are privately owned. And when you were talking about, like the media industry, your real job is socially necessary to provide good information, to give people facts so they can lead their lives better, and yet you get used just to make it for profit. And what you suggest as a solution is one of the things I'm thinking of, is like you said, go out, get your community, and form your own, guild, and do your own jobs. But I think that's huge, to just not talk about how we're privatizing everything and how the public sector is just devolving.
I was wondering, is there any measure over time, like measuring the creation of quality jobs in the economy, so-called good jobs that people find meaning and find spiritually fulfilling? And then in the good jobs agenda, is there thought to creating, meaningful jobs that people find rewarding.
And last one in the very back.
So my question is about, the fundamental message, it seems to me, that you gave us, Heidi, in particular, is that there's not, on the basis of historical experience, a great deal to worry about in terms of technological change, reducing the overall number of jobs. But it seems to me that that's overwhelmingly what we hear from the media, right? That basically the robots are coming, or whatever the title of the panel was. And so I guess the question for me is, how does that narrative get changed? I mean, I wasn't exactly expecting that to be the message from this panel when I came this morning. And I think this is a somewhat different question than why now. I mean, Peter may be right that, people who think their jobs are finally on the chopping block may be more nervous about it. But if that's not actually, I mean, there's always kind of transformation of jobs that's taking place. But the kind of terror that this image instills, that the robots are coming, everything is going to disappear, all the jobs are going to disappear to artificial intelligence, et cetera, isn't really the case, or at least you're arguing that's not the case. So it seems to me that argument, that narrative, is really not out there, and in the meantime, everybody's terrified. So what is the implication of that? Well, I have to prepare myself for the job market. I have to do all these kinds of things for myself in order to, survive in this new world that's coming. So, aside from events like this, how do we make sure that this argument, this narrative, so to speak, gets out there more successfully? Because I think it really tells a very different story and about how one responds to it.
Yes, yep.
The robots. Go ahead.
I mean, it's mostly for you.
Okay, I will. Okay. You know what? And I'm actually just going to go back to something from the prior thing, because I had this question of why are we seeing low unemployment and not seeing strong wage growth? There was some discussion of it in the last little section. Just to throw some economics at it, there is good evidence that as we've seen things like the erosion of labor standards and institutions and all this stuff, it takes a lower and lower unemployment rate for workers to actually start to see wage growth as a result of full unemployment. So full unemployment, a tighter labor market shifts leverage to workers, and because of the erosion of the other kinds of things that give worker leverage, the unemployment rate just needs to be lower, lower, lower in order for that dynamic to start happening. And I think that's one of the key things we're seeing now. Okay, a question on, are we seeing more churn, like kids coming out expecting to have more jobs? I should know the data on this, and I don't. So I don't, some others here might actually have, because it's certainly a narrative, and how does it stack up against what we're really seeing? I'm not actually sure. I do know there's certainly reasons that would lead us to be more likely for young people now to think they're going to get more jobs. One is, I think there's a pretty clear erosion of investments by employers in individual workers through the decline of things like training. We don't have pensions now. There's 401ks, and so there's definitely things that are happening that might be contributing to that. But I don't actually know this is knowable, and I don't have it at the tip of my tongue. Creation of good jobs, this question of what is the measure of the creation of good jobs, you can look at it at what share of jobs have, what's the median wages in jobs, and if you think of that productivity and then pay chart, you can really see that the creation of good jobs just flattened off starting in about the 70s as the median pay just flattened off. There's also the erosion of the share of jobs that provide employer-provided health insurance, employer-provided retirement accounts. So you can sort of get at it granularly one by one. But a thing that you said that I think cannot be emphasized enough is that it's not like the jobs that we have right now that are seen as bad jobs wouldn't be made good, meaningful jobs if they had decent wages, good benefits, good hours. Like, it's not that the work of a janitor is inherently less interesting than the work of factory work. It was just the factory work was unionized, and there was a lot of dignity in that work because it had good wages, good benefits, all the things that organizing went along with it. So I think that that's just a key backdrop to all of this. And then the other thing is productivity growth can actually lead to more interesting jobs. So productivity growth that's harnessed in a way that it's not just captured by the already affluent, but if we did all the things to make sure that was broadly shared, it could, it has the potential to mean that we have a lot more interesting jobs for workers to do. And then this question about this strong narrative we have out there that the robots are going to take all the jobs. I do not see it in the data. I sort of feel like I scream it at the top of my lungs to no avail. Like, the narrative is extremely strong out there that's what's happening. I think the threat is that it is a big distraction from real problems. You get people to worry about that, and it's a distraction from like very, very real things that are going on in the labor market. So I don't know the answer to that. If anyone knows, I would love to hear it.
Yeah, I mean, just quickly on the good jobs thing, I think, right, I basically agree with everything you said. I just sort of, I mean, this idea of sort of like fulfillment or something in jobs sort of came out of what you said, and I'm always very leery of that, just because, I think for me, we need higher wages, we need shorter hours, we need more stability and benefits and control over the workplace environment itself. I think the question of sort of fulfillment in something that is still fundamentally alienated labor doing something at the command of somebody else is a kind of dangerous road to go down, in the sense that, like, it's one of the ideological kind of moves of our contemporary neoliberal capitalism to basically tell people to, like, substitute the love of the job for, like, actually money and control over your time and those sorts of things. I mean, that's my just sort of political vantage point from a sort of like post work anti-wage labor perspective that I wanted. I'm concerned about the jobs providing people with what they need, an income in as little time as possible, and hopefully creating opportunities for people to find fulfillment elsewhere. As for this question about the media narrative and the general cultural narratives about jobs and automation, I mean, I obviously don't have the answer to it either. The best thing I've been able to come up with is just broadening the historical contextualization of it, to point out that this is not some new thing that just appeared on the scene, but is in fact this basic contradiction of capitalism, this fight between rising productivity either accruing to the profits of the capitalist class or being distributed in the form of wealth and in the form of time to the masses. And so, I think one thing you can say, for example, that the graph that Heidi showed of the disjunction after the 70s between productivity and wages, I mean, I've used that graph many times. It's very useful. However, I think it's worth sort of, it can sometimes mislead people into thinking that, like, before that was just the sort of the correlation between productivity growth and rising wages was just like a basic fact of the economy before that, when it's actually, I would argue, if we had the statistics, we don't have the statistics on this that we can go back to, 1800. But I think it's, at least the evidence, that I'm familiar with suggests that we're really talking about a particular period of time when, again, it was political victories and organizing victories and unionization and other things, socialist movements, that caused that period when rising productivity correlated with rising wages. And so it's if you don't look at that entire history, it's easy to think, well, we're just in this sort of like we've entered into something unusual rather than in some ways returned to just a basic contradiction of capitalism that has to be resolved politically and not technologically.
I just wanted to respond to the comment about this pervasive narrative that's fed to us in the media. just about which is such a useful tool for employers, for capitalists. If workers are constantly being fed this narrative that the robots are coming and that you can be, that you're next, right? You have a bullseye on your back. It's a really effective tool. And so I think it also speaks to the lack of, we don't have any labor reporting in this country. We don't have any labor reporting at all. We have a handful of labor reporters. Labor reporters at most publications are actually they're reporting on the jobs report, so they'll report on what came out this morning. We're fed these numbers every single month. We're told that unemployment is at this rate or that rate. This doesn't mean anything to working people. It's not tangible, it's not accessible. What they do know is the day-to-day misery in their job. What they do know is that they've been a permalancer for a year. What they do know is that, they're working longer hours and they're more unhappy than ever and they're on 3 different medications because they're depressed, but we don't have any reporting on this. And the reporting that actually exists on this is rare. I mean, I remember, when I was younger, I remember reading even in the New York Times, I remember, was it Louis Ucatel? Did I just botch his name? I probably did. But I remember he did extensive reporting on downsizing. And I remember at that time, at that age, as a young person, reading that, and it put so much color to an economic trend, even at that age. And so we don't have the stories of workers. I mean, we're seeing much more of it because it's just, there's been how could you not cover the teacher uprising that's been happening in the last few months? But on the whole, we've seen the number of labor reporters dwindle. We see more media, most media organizations willing to hire an economy reporter, but not to really talk about worker struggles, the working conditions of people. And I think that would do a real service in countering the really, dry, kind of inhumane statistics that we see that paint a very different picture than what working people in this country are actually feeling and experiencing on a daily basis.
Okay, we have time for 4 more questions, and I already know who I'm going to call, so I'm just going to, so these 2, you, and over there. And I'm sorry for the rest, but you'll be able to talk, you'll be around. Oh, I hope.
I would like to know your opinion on, do you agree and believe that workers today are always in transition in terms of adding new skills, even when they are currently employed, let alone the dislocated and displaced workers? And do you think the organizations and the employers are helping to that end so that the employers are always learning? And do you feel education system, especially the higher education, is helping, can help in different ways, or do you believe there is a need of transformation in that end as well?
I'd just like to speak about a couple things. Just one is the chart that was shown that showed a lack of growth and productivity in recent years, and I think in part of that I think is just a lack of investment in education. I mean, you look at what's going on in Arizona. They're hiring people on H-1 visas because they can't get people to work in the public schools there because the pay is so damn low. So, I mean, there's that. The other thing is technology itself and how technology gets developed. Why is technology developed the way it is? If it's the people at the top who are determining how the technology gets developed, then it's going to be technology that represses people at the bottom. And that's, I think, something that we need to look at. And I think unions need to start looking at organizing engineers. Engineers are precarious workers as well. A lot of them are working on 1099 basis. But there's been no real thought gone into, okay, so what kind of a technology do we need to develop that is going to be a liberating technology, that's going to really develop people?
I really appreciate a lot of what's been said so far. And the question that I'm raising is around a sort of central umbrella, which is a solidarity question, the question of building and sustaining solidarity. And it sort of breaks out in a couple of ways, but I'd really like responses from each of the panelists because they each have a very unique perspective on what I'm struggling with in practical terms, in organizing, advocacy, and activist terms. So there's this issue of worker identity, power, both political and interpersonal, and the notion of precarity. And the reason why it's a solidarity question for me is because a part of it is connected with this notion of value or values, what is valuable. So if one of the values is the notion of the dignity of work, right, that work has dignity and there's a human contribution to community, that's a part of the definition of work. Not labor in the abstract, but personal and interpersonal and community work in the concrete. That what you are doing matters. You're not simply a meat machine in a specific slot. One of you raised the notion that how can you really find fulfillment when you're still sort of in an alienated labor position? And I think that that's very valid from the perspective that it's a solidarity question for me because what I've seen is that there is a consistent division in class identity, and America has a unique sort of disease of class denial. Like nobody is working class, everybody is middle class, and other sort of self-delusional nonsense about one's place in the system, right? So I'm interested in the solidarity between different groups of people who not just didn't really identify with each other before, but had active antipathy or disdain for each other before. But they all find themselves now in precarity. So setting aside the fact that there have been multiple cycles of the betrayal of black and brown people by white labor, now I would like a sort of answer to one related questions. How do we build solidarity? How do we deal with the definition of what is a worker now, right? The definition of what is working class, what is a worker, especially given the fact that the people who are facing precarity cross really big boundaries. So you have people coming out of J school, you have people coming out of law school, and you have people coming out of business school who find themselves in debt. And that debt bondage makes them fearful and controllable, but they still have a disdain or distance from working people and an identity with their bosses. If you could speak to that, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you. Last question, please make it as short as possible.
Yeah, I just thought that there was a great panel, great ideas. I thought it was a great question about why now. About why now? So I just came to New York from working in a newspaper in Oakland, and I worked on the same thing. I just couldn't figure out where's this PR storm coming from. And just one, I agree with the smartphones. We all look at our smartphones. We all think about that. I certainly am addicted to that in that kind of way. But a second is the foundations. There's a huge amount of money pouring into kind of moderate liberal, somebody talked about that earlier, organizations from Rockefeller, Soros, Ford, Casey, and they're really scared. They're concerned about inequality, they're concerned about gender issues, but they dislike unions, they dislike collective bargaining, they dislike worker power, and they've hired just a coterie of moderate liberals, a lot of folks who were in the 2008 Obama campaign, PR campaign, and they're just all over. There's a labor-oriented online newspaper now called Capital on Main, and it's running this podcast. It's from Sacramento. It's running this podcast all about how wonderful robots are and how wonderful the new economy is. And I mean, it's just something. So it's not just, and I think everybody probably knows, it's not just some kind of amorphous factors. There's an active PR campaign that's going on as well.
Okay.
I can go first. I don't think I have a ton, unfortunately, to say. I mean, like on this, the question of this sort of workers being in transition and the role of employers in education. I mean, in some ways, that's again, I don't have like sort of quantification of that in front of me. In some ways, it's always been true. Part of what we've seen, I think, is the tendency of employers to simply refuse responsibility for facilitating those transitions, right? So you had, historically, you would have apprenticeships and on-the-job training and things where, now the joke is people put out ads for, people that they want someone who has 10 years of experience in a programming language that was invented 5 years ago. And so it's sort of like pushing off all of that stuff, from the employer. The education thing is tricky because I think this is one of the, in these Rise of the Robot stories, one of the things that you get in this sort of liberal center-left sort of discourse that the other brother was just talking about is this idea that, well, if we just re-educate people, then that'll we just need better education or more education, and then say everyone should go into the STEM fields, and then you get. But then if the labor market there is still, if workers are still weak and disorganized, then you just get gluts of low-paid labor in a different field. I would also add to that I think it's important as a political principle to value education as something more than job training, and as you could call it education for citizenship or that sort of discourse, but also just if we're talking about, as I've been talking about, the idea of freeing up more of our time, more of our free time outside of work, well then education is how you sort of develop the interests and the talents that allow you to actually enjoy that and experience it as like as fulfillment rather than as just kind of dissipation and boredom. Other thing anything else I wanted to say? That's all I'm going to say. I'll let Nasran, did you want to speak to this solidarity question, which is it's a very important question. I just don't know exactly how to address it.
Yeah, I think this is a really. I think I can only speak from my experience. What I related earlier that I. For a very long time, I, like many others, had a deep hostility towards the media. Especially when I've been a Marxist from this young, and you grew up in a Marxist household, and I started organizing, when I was 16, and so media just always seemed like the enemy, and so it's been really, I think, instructive for me to see different types of workers, how they get to a certain place, and also that there are different types of workers working in different industries. Like this is not even though I'm sure there is a stereotype of a well-to-do white elite media worker, there are all different types of workers in media. And so while many of our members at the New York Times are making upwards of $100,000 a year, I also work with journalists that are making $30,000 a year, and so that are saddled with debt and have very few job prospects. And so this arriving at this point where you have this class consciousness and you're actually connecting to other workers, it really depends what your day-to-day, right, your being determines your consciousness. And so these are different types of workers that are in different types of workplaces. And so obviously it's a much easier conversation for a 25-year-old digital media worker that's making $32,000 a year that just joined the DSA, and a journalist that's been working in a legacy newsroom and has had the benefits of a union contract for over 30 years. These are very different types of workers within the same industry. But I think looking at the intellectual laborers, so when we're looking at college campuses and journalism and engineers, there actually is organizing happening amongst engineers, software engineers. For any of you who have been following what happened at Lanetex, where a group of software engineers organized, and these are typically highly paid professions, but these workers still came together in an industry that typically has been labeled as unorganizable just because of the nature of the work. They organized, and they were all fired for organizing, for joining the News Guild. And so the attention paid to that campaign has really, anyway, a lot of engineers are actually organizing. But I think this is the question of solidarity across industries is a very difficult one. And I think using media and social media as a tool to connect different workers together, and seeing that organizing is happening in industries that typically were not organizing. I think we're only going to see more solidarity shown. And I mean, ideally, we're in a place where a lot of those, those walls break down. But also, I'm not going to pretend to imagine that, the New York Times journalists are going to be showing up on a picket line of low-wage restaurant workers. But I think that organizing, the labor movement is the key to this. Again, I know it's really cliche, but this should be a mass movement across industries, and a platform, a space for different workers to connect as workers, no matter what they're doing. Not cops, but workers connecting across industries. And so when we look at, the condition of the labor movement, that's the one thing that we need to point back to. Even in this city, I mean, we have the highest union density, right, Ruth? The highest union density in the country, and we still have a fractured labor movement, a very fractured labor movement. I mean, we have to be honest, even in this city. And so it would be wonderful if we had more spaces. Like the Murphy Institute is actually a unique space within this city and within this country, but if we had more spaces like this to bring workers across different industries to learn from one another and to connect their struggles, I think we'd be in a very different place. Nonprofits and foundations, yeah, I mean, that's a big one. That's a big one. I think I'm not going to tackle that because I really do hate foundations, so.
I'm not going to speak to that either. I will, yes, so I would just want to make a couple of points on I showed you the chart. Productivity growth is actually unusually low right now, contrary to what the sort of public discussion is about it. When I think of things to boost productivity growth, one of them is what you said, like if we actually increase labor standards and institutions, we will almost counterintuitively actually also boost productivity growth. So it's a win-win. Making other kinds of investments. We know business investment is very low right now, so government investment in things like education, in things like infrastructure, those are core things that we should be doing right now to increase productivity growth. And then the other thing that I will just say in this question of how do we change the narrative is the one thing that I have found will make people pause when I'm talking to not this kind of audience, but a more mainstream audience, is I will just say, I have devoted my entire career to worrying about the labor market and what's happening with low and moderate income workers. I am a pessimist. I see problems everywhere. And I am not worried that robots are taking all the jobs. Like, that is one thing that I've gotten people to maybe realize, that this is on the list of 20 things I'm concerned about. This doesn't even hit it. So, okay.
Okay, so in conclusion, the robots are here maybe or no, but lunch is here, definitely. So first, let's give us a round of applause to the, I've been given two notes that I have to communicate. So because there's so many people, and maybe